I think seeing that in black and white on the letter when we got that, saying that was kind of, I remember I was on the phone to my friend and I was just like, I just had a letter through and she's in heart failure. And they were like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
and I was
it's bizarre,
like, well,
isn't it? Because the medical professions don't always use the worst case sort of terminology.
They might said it to us.
Worst case, they might talk around it, but they don't always use the terminology until they write the letter. Because we've had that as well with Lucy with a few things where we've been like, oh, that's actually what's going on.
Yeah, and I think
because then when you Google it, it gives you the absolute, 100%, this is what this is, whereas the doctors can sometimes talk around it a little bit to try and alleviate your anxiety.
And that was absolutely the case, that they hadn't used the words heart failure until we got the letter. And that was a shocker, that one.
You've mentioned Andrew quite a few times. I think it's only fair to Andrew, really, that we maybe find out a little bit more about Andrew and about how Andrew felt during this, the Ava's birth and the diagnosis and her heart surgery. Tell us a little bit about Andrew.
So the one thing that does stick out in my head is once we'd had the diagnosis of Down syndrome, and I think he was very much in his head thinking how to manage expectations. So the one thing that really stuck out for me was he'd said, well, she's not going to be able to drive a car. So my instant reaction, I just went straight on and Googled people with Down syndrome, driving license, like that. Yeah. And I was like, see, there you go. All these people with Down syndrome who've got driving licenses who can drive. And it was very much well, she might not get married. Look, here. So he was very much...
Heidi and James.
Well, they were married at that point.
They were together but not married at that point, yeah.
So there was a lot of, oh, well, she probably won't do this or she might not do that and she might not. And I was very much trying to kind of counter that of it may happen, it might not happen. And I think I've already said kind of that was the point when I said to him, she's not going to be defined by her diagnosis. And I think that helped him to maybe process actually can't write her future yet because we don't know. And he knew that she had me as a mum.
But it is a hard thing not to define that future. It's you do jump to conclusions and sadly, despite all of the work that everybody is doing around the world constantly, there are still misconceptions and there are still those assumptions that people will make. And I still find myself making them about Lucy, and I have to stop myself and think she might not do it within a specific time period that's typical, but she probably will get there. Yeah. And I just have to take a step back.
At that point, he was grieving for the child that he thought he was going to have and didn't. And I guess this is me interpreting him in that situation, and he might tell me I'm doing him a disservice. I don't know. I think, as I said, it was the diagnosis around the AVSD that was probably the hardest for me, but equally I think that was the hardest for him to deal with as well. So he would probably say that he doesn't, but he does have a tendency to go to worst case scenarios in situations. So I think he was a lot more concerned in that 4-month period from kind of her birth and the diagnosis to get into where we had the heart surgery. There was a lot of up and downs, obviously battling with the feeding. She just wasn't gaining weight. There was so many issues.
And that's hard for him. If you're wanting to breastfeed and pushing that, then he can't be involved necessarily in what she is feeding.
Well, so
whereas
all of the children, we've mixed.
You still did do
them.
bottles, so you would express and
did it, which was fine, and he could be part of it, and the older two children could be part of that. The issue there came. The hospital gave us the wrong milk. They gave us some high-calorie milk that was only supposed to be for NG tube because it tastes really bitter, and they gave it to us to put in her bottle, and that put her off the bottle, and she then refused point blank to have the bottle anymore. So then the pressure did come back on to me for that, and so I think that was the point before we'd got to the NG tube. So yeah, I guess from his point of view, I know like there were times when I felt like I was failing her because she wasn't gaining the weight from the breast milk alone. It wasn't anything to do with my milk, though. It was purely the fact that her tiny little body at that point, all of the energy she was taking from the milk was going on her organs.
Yes. Yeah,
working.
Lucy's always been very low weight, even though she wasn't symptomatic, even up to having a surgery at 16 months. She always followed a very low line on the weight scale. And that they told me that was because her heart was working extra
Ava
hard
was
and burning extra calories.
Not far off dropping off the bottom of the Down syndrome growth chart anyway as well.
Yeah,
She was right at the bottom within that. But yeah, so I guess kind of Andrew found it hard to see how frustrated I was getting with myself and not being able to necessarily help with that side of things. I guess there was a bit more of a relief. So when she did eventually get the NG tube, he would quite often take like the night feed. So the way that we worked it, we worked this with the dietitian because I was adamant. It was very much if she's feeding from the tube, she's not going to be hungry enough to then want to breastfeed. So we're in this vicious
there's a very fine line, isn't there? Yeah. So I don't think people realise. And especially when your brain is fuddled from just having a baby. You were, because you'd had two before, you knew that could be a thing and it was in your mind. Whereas I think a lot of new parents with their first child wouldn't necessarily think, hang on a minute, if I'm giving them all this food through the tube,
they're not going to want.
Why are they going to want to get the breast milk?
And it's the same even if you bottle feed. That was the one thing that we found, that even if you bottle feed, then less likely to then want to kind of, it keeps them fuller for longer. So with the NG tube, we did kind of discuss with the dietitian, and they agreed to let us breastfeed through the day, but we had to record it. So we had a role there because, like, whenever I was feeding, he had to writing
the numbers down. And Andrew does like numbers.
He does. Yeah, we both like numbers. So so he was kind of recording when I was feeding and how long she was feeding for, so that we then knew how much to feed her through the night. Well, just before nighttime, slightly into the nighttime, through the NG tube, because that was the other added thing, that she couldn't cope with bolus feeding. She was projectile vomiting.